Welcome to Inspiring Heartfelt Conversations. My name is Barbara Morningstar. This series is presented by Inaudi's COCOON, which offers education on a range of end-of-life topics in the form of talks, workshops, and writings. For more information, you can go to inaudimscocoon.com. Today, my guest is Lisa Smartt. Lisa is a linguist, educator, and poet. She is the author of Words at the Threshold, What We Say When We're Nearing Death. The book is based on data collected through the Final Words Project, an ongoing study devoted to gathering and interpreting the mysterious language at end of life. She has worked closely with Raymond Moody, guided by his research into language. Welcome, Lisa.
Welcome. Great to be here, Barbara.
So you can tell just by the introduction that we're going to be talking about the changing language of end of life. And I'm really excited about this, actually, because this is a topic that I believe is significant, but has not been given enough attention. And people are going to learn a lot today about your research and why the language is so important to pay attention to. But before we move into that, can you explain, for some people that say a linguist, what does a linguist do? So what's the role of a linguist? Can you give us kind of a general overview of what a linguist's role is?
Overall, a linguist studies language and the patterns of language. And some linguists are polyglots. They speak lots of different languages and become interpreters and so forth. And I'm not that kind of linguist. But there are other kinds of linguists who, I speak a few languages, but really what interested me was more the mechanisms or the connection between language and thought and language and consciousness. And I was particularly intrigued by people who learn differently, who have dyslexia or who are neurodivergent, because we'll see problems with language processing. And early on, I became very, very curious about what was going on with people. So part of what linguistics does is, we have language. You hear me talking to you right now. And in some ways, it reveals what's going on cognitively with me. So for example, for a while, I studied men's language, or it was called male language, and female language. And there were certain differences. It's changed over time. But one of the kinds of differences is in the past, women would say something like, "Nice day, isn't it?" and say something that would be asking for approval, or it would be a kind of a marker of submission, right? Because when you ask a question, oftentimes you're deferring to another person's authority. So in the past, this is older research, there was this idea that women's language had more markers of deference. That's changed, however. It truly has over time. But that was the kind of research I was doing early on in my career when I was first getting into linguistics. How does language reveal how the mind works, how power dynamics work, how psychology works, how sociology works, right? We know that if a certain person wants a job and they speak with certain kinds of patterns linguistically, they may be considered as inferior for the job just because their language may not be considered standard language or might, have a certain kind of dialect, right? So language is powerful. It's not just a bunch of words coming out of our mouth, but it reveals our psychology, our sociology, our economic status, our power dynamics, right? You notice that when there's someone who feels more powerful than another person, they're more likely to interrupt them over and over again, right? You'll see more cases of interruption. So what a linguist does on the surface is study patterns of language, and what that can reveal is a lot, as I've indicated. So, and then as a linguist, we have certain things to look for. Are there a lot of questions? Are there hedges, what I call hedges, where you're sort of like, well, I kind of want to tell you about this, but I'm not really going to say it. So there are kinds of patterns that appear in language that reveal how our psychology is or how we're processing. And so that's my passion. That's the part of linguistics that I do. And I ended up using it before I got into this work with final words, I was using it working with adults who were very bright but had trouble processing language, who were dyslexic or had, so I was like trying to figure out what's going on with them, that they're having problems with certain kinds of breaking down words or writing. I worked with engineers, for example, who, were brilliant at imagining building bridges or bookcases, but they couldn't write a sentence if their life depended on it, right? Or it was really hard. So what's going on? What's going on? So it's a very comprehensive answer to your question.
A fascinating answer, though, even from different, as you say, going into different areas of neurodiversity or different ways of interpreting the world, how language can be affected even in its interpretation, right? So
right, exactly.
Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, so we're going to move into your beautiful father.
Mm.
And I just want to, I've seen a few of your other interviews, but I just want to start moving into his influence by honoring him with the dedication that you gave at the beginning of the book. And you say, "For my father, who continues to sing to me in an octave higher than grief."
Mm.
I don't know, that really touched me. So your father's last words had deep influence on you. Can you explain how that led you into this work?
Wow. Thank you for reading that dedication. I forgot that's what I said. And that came from one of his poems that he wrote about an octave higher than grief. My dad's influence was very profound from, all throughout my life. He loved words. He loved language. He was a poet. And he inspired me just a love for language, obviously. But I never expected that his influence would go as deeply and change my life as profoundly as it did in the last 3 weeks of his life, where he was over-radiated for cancer. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it led to a very serious infection. So there was he had pretty routine prostate cancer that, we all thought he was going to survive. And just as life can sometimes happen, someone made a mistake somewhere, and he was over-radiated. And so in a very short period of time, he got this very severe infection, and he basically died over a 3-week period. And he knew right away. When we were at the hospital, I remember they were saying, "Well, stay here and we can do this, and we might be able to do this for you and do this." And he looked and he just shook his head and he said, "Take me home. Mm-hmm. Take me home." And he never finished the sentence, "Take me home to die." But it was, this is one thing about the words at the threshold. So often there's so much implied that we all seem to know, or many of us, not always, but there are these understandings often between people who are close. So we took him home. And I witnessed something I never expected from my father, who was, even though he had a very deep soul and spirit, I would not call him a spiritual person. He, was a PhD, very rational, and he was also from New York and very salt of the earth, and he loved going to the horse races, and he was, again, lower class, in his history. He came from an environment where he was the first in his family to be educated. So he just had this whole very kind of salt of the earth thing, vibe to him. And the whole idea of angels and all that, he was just like rolled his eyes. He came from a family where it's like, no, we're talking about the racetrack and cookies and, corned beef sandwiches and, so it's a very down to earth thing, even though he had really, also in addition to, as he had the soul of a poet. So, we took him home, and very quickly something shifted in him, and it just began with his language changing. And it first happened when he walked out the front door of the house on a January night in his underwear. Oh. It was, and that's how this whole process began. And he started talking when the cops got him about these boxes he was carrying to my mother's art exhibition. And, really was complete nonsense. I mean, there were no boxes in his hands. The police, that's why they ended up bringing him back to the hospital. And, but really that began what I learned about metaphoric language, because I talk in my book about signature metaphors, or metaphors that are really dear to a person's heart into their lives. And my mother is an artist, and for 50 plus years, he would carry his boxes to her art exhibitions, and was very proud of the fact that he was married to a wonderful artist and that he could help her in that way. So, but it was the big event coming. This big art show was coming, and he was out there ready to carry boxes, and he was very disoriented. We got him back home again, but that was the first thing, and I was intrigued, like my ears perked up, like, why did he talk about boxes? And and that's the first time I drew out my pen and began to write down the things my father was saying as he entered this period of dying. So I just sat with him over a 3-week period every day after work and just tracked his language, and some of it was very poetic. Lisa, there's so much sorrow. Oh no, there's so much so in sorrow. Which of course is a completely nonsensical sentence. And yet there's so much so in sorrow. And that was early on. He looked at me knowing that, we were both entering into a period of grieving. And then something shifted, because it was sort of like, first he named the sorrow and the grief, and then he really began to enter into another dimension or zone. And again, my father was a skeptic, very down-to-earth guy. If I used the word angel at all, he would roll his eyes and right, get out a cigar. Yeah, right. Maybe a week into this process of dying from this really serious infection, he just one day we were holding hands, and his eyes kind of popped up, and he was looking, and he looked at me and said, "Oh my God, Lisa, you were right about the angels." Oh. And I just, I was stunned. I never thought my kind of crusty, I guess the word is kind of a crusty guy with a good heart, I never thought the day would come where, and it's not that I was, always running around dreaming of angels, but I had more of a spiritual aspect to me throughout my life. So he started talking about angels in the room. He talked about the green dimension, that he began to see these like green landscapes, and he talked about, tell Jack was his best friend. Jack had passed away, and he said, yes, Jack's trying to reach me. Tell Jack my modality is broken. And, kind of like modem, but, modality. And so there was this language that was rich, and on the surface, again, was complete nonsense. But something in me, also because we shared poetry, there was always sort of the poet's ear to the kind of metaphors that were in the so-called nonsense. And again, something like so much so in sorrow. Language isn't always just about give me the cup, right? Language is much richer than that. So my father's dying process, just besides being a grieving daughter, I was also the linguist that he encouraged me to be, and I just noted the language. Towards the very end, I remember him saying he had a secretary who he really was very close to, and he was talking to her on the phone. This was really close to his dying. I think it was very close, 1 to 5, very, very close. Yeah, maybe 3 to 5 days or 2 to 5 days. But she called, and he said, "Oh my gosh, Alice, this is so interesting. I've never done this before." And I remember thinking of the this, and they call that non-referential language because we didn't know what the this is, right? What was that this? Alice, this is so interesting. And I remember hearing that and I was like, what is the this? Is it dying? Is it that he's going somewhere else? Is it being in bed for 3 weeks? And that non-referential language, later I would come to find out, is common at the end of life, and it's also common in Alzheimer's and diseases like that. So there were just certain things that just perked up my ears. He talked about wanting to go to Las Vegas in his oxygen tank, or what do you call it? Oxygen tent. So he wasn't in an oxygen tent, but he was obviously feeling that his breath was going. He was a gambler. Like, one of his favorite things in the world was to go to Las Vegas. So his idea of I want to take that great trip to Las Vegas. So he started talking about the trip to Las Vegas, and it really kind of, perked up my ears again. Like, wow, why Las Vegas, and what trip, and where is he going? And so all these questions were front and center for me. The very last one, I'm just remembering things now, was that one day he had a pencil, and he was like kind of pushing it against his body. And even though I knew he was dying, I didn't want him to hurt himself. And I said, Daddy, what are you doing? And he said, I'm trying to see if I can get this to the other side. Now, at the time, I didn't understand metaphor or anything. I was like, Daddy, give me the pencil. I was worried. But now I'd be like, to the other side, tell me more about, now I would explore it. But I remember how at that moment I was so baffled and kind of afraid by what he was talking about, because I didn't want him to hurt himself. And of course, too, it's like, oh my God, Daddy's so crazy right now, or whatever, all the, fears you can have. But at the same time, too, because I was trained as a linguist to have no judgment about language, I just kept writing it down. Because, if I were to hear Chinese right now, it would make no sense to me. Mm-hmm. I don't know Chinese. So I could say, oh my God, it's just all nonsense. It's not valid as a language, right? It's just nonsense. So it doesn't count. Well, that's not, I know as a linguist, every language counts. Mm-hmm. Every language is valid, and every dialect, right? There are certain dialects that we think of as being somewhere, on the social strata, right? Or, somewhere. But all language is sophisticated and meaningful and well-developed. And all languages, all dialects are. There's no inferior language, even though we're trained to think that way sometimes. Mm-hmm. So gratefully, I was trained as a linguist to walk in there with all language is valid. And all language is a reflection and a function of the human mind and the human process. So,
well, I just want to honor that because, as you say, you do speak throughout your book about the study of nonsensical language as it's coming up, but also when I've noticed when it moves from a literal and concrete place at end of life into these metaphors, as you say, it can be intimidating for people or discounting, but you were trained as a linguist to say, wait a minute, this is unique and it's my dad, but it's unique and interesting, leading you into this research. So I just think that's absolutely beautiful. And what I want to invite everybody to do as we go deeper into the conversation, because it's so rich and a lot is missed if we discount it, right? So beautiful that you've honored it. And this is a big part of your focus right now. So let's just talk about nonsensical. This is a big part of your research and your distinguishing of patterns and reflections. So can you tell me a little bit about what you mean as a broad sense of nonsensical language?
Yeah, there are a couple of things I want to say. One thing that segues with what I was mentioning earlier, and thank you so much for getting it and really valuing this work and these questions. Raymond Moody, who coined the term near-death experience, when he was a medical student, he had these people who were resuscitated come back with these stories that other doctors claimed were just nonsense. They were nonsense. Oh, I died, I left my body, I was up above hovering, I went through a tunnel. I mean, there were a collection of things they were describing that to our ordinary senses, is nonsensical, right? I mean, I don't, as far as I know, I'm not, above my body all the time, looking down most of the time. I'm not. And, so, those things that we tie to sensory experience is what we think of as sensical. But so he had these patients who would come back from their experiences talking what most people thought was just nonsense. Now, the interesting thing about Raymond Moody, who's a friend and was a mentor early on in this process and still is a mentor, he also has a PhD in philosophy. Okay, he's an MD, but he also has a PhD in philosophy. And he studied unintelligible language. He studied nonsense. Mm-hmm. It was his studying of nonsense that set him up for being open as a medical student, because he knew that nonsense was as valid a language expression and function of being human as sensical language. For example, Dr. Seuss, he often refers to. Do you know how many books Dr. Seuss has sold?
No, I don't know how many he sold, actually. But
where he's doing a lot better.
It's like millions I'm sure. We all know it from our childhood, right? So.
And that's sheer, a lot of it's nonsense. And so, one of the things that Raymond said is that there is something in us that has this nonsensical tendency or desire or interest. I mean, we can also be repelled by it, but it definitely is part of the human lexicon and vocabulary. So Raymond, from his PhD work when he was young, had an interest in nonsense, and he valued nonsense. He always valued nonsense. So when he was a young medical student and people were coming back with these experiences, instead of dismissing them, he said, you know what? Language has patterns. Mm. And I know this as a linguist. Language has patterns. And these people's stories are basically language. And these experiences, so he just started writing things down. And I'll be darned, after 50 of them, he started saying, oh my gosh, every one of these nonsensical stories have the same pattern. Starts with the with the going out of their bodies, then going through a tunnel. And so what he found is what looked like nonsense at first, when you just took a deep breath and got past, because we do have this reaction like, oh my God, it doesn't make sense to my ordinary reality.
The literal side of things.
The literal side of things. Mm-hmm. And we just, we do have a reaction to that language often, but he, because of his own training in philosophy, didn't do that. So he sat down and just very methodically captured these near-death experiences and just to look at the patterns, and I'll be darned, they emerged. Mm. Well, I didn't know Raymond Moody. I hadn't met Raymond Moody yet when I sat down at my father's bedside, but trained as a linguist, I had that same impulse. Just let's see if there are patterns that are emerging in my father's language, or let me at least write them down and see if I can make sense of it, or just see what emerges. So nonsense. Really, nonsense, we think of it as maybe being inferior or sub-language because it confuses us. But actually, nonsense is nonsense because it breaks the rules of what we know about sense. Like, we wouldn't know something was nonsense if we didn't know what sense was. Mm-hmm. So really, you can think of nonsense as actually maybe being more sophisticated and complicated. At least intentional nonsense is, right? Because you're taking something that is known and then you're kind of playing around with it or breaking the rules. So Raymond, again, because he has been such an important influence on me and my work, or been at least a great corollary to it, his work, he came up with 70 types of nonsense. This was way back before, he was in his 20s. It's almost embarrassing when you think about it. He's so bright, so visionary, but he came up with 70 types of nonsense. And So I was just beginning to notice types of nonsense in my father's language. And because, so nonsense, as I hope is clear, is what we don't think of as making sense in our ordinary literal reality, right? And if you had sort of a continuum of language, we have something like, Lisa is drinking from a cup of tea, and we'd probably both agree that that makes sense. This is a cup, right?
Right.
Now, if I said to you, my heart is a cup, it's running
Poetic.
Oh, but that's a metaphor, right? It's poetic. Right. It's bringing together. But there is some truth. I do have a heart here, right? I mean, there is a heart, and you can kind of imagine a heart as a cup. So there's some literal reality, but there's literal, but there's something that's not, right? Something that's an image or almost, nonsensical in some ways, because my heart's not a cup or whatever. But so you go from literal to metaphor, where the metaphor kind of bridges the two realms, and then you go all the way to nonsense, where the cup of the night. Well, God, it seems like let's see if I can get to something really nonsensical. Cup of down summer one. Right? Now we're meaning-making critters, so we want to try to make meaning of it. And you can see how hard it was for me to do nonsense, right? When I really, especially me, because I'm a poet too. But, it's when it's very clearly nonsensical. You can't make a sense of it. You can't make a metaphor of it. It's more in the realm of nonsense. Now, for example, if I said to you, I'm going to go to the ATM, if I said that to you 100 years ago, you would look.
It would make sense.
It would make sense. So a lot of times, too, certain things only make sense in context, right? That's situational nonsense. That certain things in certain contexts don't make sense. And then there's linguistic nonsense, where the actual sentence is nonsense. Well, going back to there's so much so in sorrow. You don't have so in sorrow. Mm-hmm. And that's barely a metaphor. It really isn't quite a metaphor. It's right on the edge, right? So nonsense. Is that helpful?
It is helpful, because it kind of breaks up sort of the literal approach to things and moving into metaphors. And what we've talked about, the word ineffable comes up, something so much bigger than what can be defined in words, right? So often my understanding from what you're saying is that nonsensical language starts to show up when you move into that kind of broader area where it's harder to define, right? So am I reflecting that back appropriately?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yes, yeah.
Well, and so sorry, go ahead if you want to say something.
Well, you just think of all the experiences in life that are ineffable, like incredible sunset, or being wildly in love, or any of those things, that just, there are certain things like, this is very interesting, Alice. You could definitely say that about love. It's like that big this, like what is it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, so I want to bridge now specifically to, like, your father, people nearing death. And I want to give a nod to the book Final Gifts by two hospice nurses years ago, Patricia Kelly and Maggie Callanan, because I started in the hospice field in the early 90s, and they were courageous to put that book out initially. And they were talking about nearing death awareness, the things that we're touching. And I remember kind of being at medical round when I was on staff at the first hospice, sort of at medical rounds, kind of reading the book under the table, because it wasn't discussed as openly as it is now. But they were the first ones to help me be more attuned in my hospice work when the patients started saying unique things. But so you have some key categories. I do want to highlight a little bit the signature metaphor that you brought up, because I think that's sometimes missed and really important. But what are the other categories? I know travel is one. What are the other? You had three main categories that I see within the book. Could you give me just an end of life that we often see?
Yeah. Well, I'm embarrassed. So
Okay, so travel. Let's talk about travel and preparing for a journey.
this is so funny. Momentous travel.
And the other one was the one your dad was talking about, where you're mending something that's broken, a machine that's not working, or
Yeah.
something breaking down. Those were three
Yeah.
keys. There's probably so much more, but those were
That's why
three
I was
that you
concerned.
highlighted.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, that's really, so you have travel, we have the signature metaphor, and also there's a lot about weather. I mean, often that was the other thing about people talking about, there's a storm coming. But let me start back to
Travel and journey is a big one.
yeah, travel and journey, I think, are the most common, where people talk about some kind of travel coming. And I'm going to just read some ones. Thank you for, there's so many of them, just trying to think. Well, tell Tim and Mary we are at a point of departure now. And, I'm concerned about the traffic going north. I lost my passport. I can't seem to find
Passport and papers, getting ready. That comes up a lot in palliative and hospice. We've seen that so much. Wanting to get the passport, needing to get the papers ready. Where's my suitcase? So it's what do you need for the journey, right?
Exactly. And the passport did come up a lot. I was surprised. And then there are people talking about the yellow bus full of people and the car that needs gas. So all of these things emerge. And again, if you're not stepping into those conversations with a sense of metaphor, Dad, don't worry about the car. It's fine. Because one example is, okay, we need to gas up the car. Don't worry, Dad, everything's fine. I took care of the car, which is, getting closer, but even more engaging might be like, let's talk about the car. I'm sure, well, actually, Dad, I just gassed up the car is probably just the right thing to say.
Right.
Actually. But not to be
support them in the reflective words that are coming forward then.
Yeah, just support them and acknowledge, because we don't really know. I mean, we don't really know what's going on, and we know, I mean, language is sort of a handle, but we have no idea what's going on. And to step into the other person's reality is really the best support, because maybe there is a passport.
Well, I remember my father died a few years ago, and he got his private pilot's license later in life. And at one point, my sister was visiting, and he'd had sort of mini strokes, and we almost thought he was going to go, and then he'd rally. But he was sitting in front of my sister one time, and he looked at her, and he was in a facility, and he said, "I know there's a plane waiting for me outside, and I can take it anytime I want, but I'm not ready to go yet."
Amazing. How powerful.
It was very powerful, right? So, but also you talk about, like with your father, large momentous events, or something that they're attending to, like a machine not working or mending something. Can you speak to those ones? I hadn't heard of the breaking down or mending, but that would make sense as the body's breaking down too.
Yeah, and it surprised me how much I heard that one about something broken down or needing repair, or it's not, something about fixing. And then I looked at George Lakoff's work, who does a lot with metaphor, and apparently, that the machine metaphors is a really powerful one for us culturally, right? About things breaking down. So that emerged a fair amount in the transcripts. And the momentous event is, what I mentioned a little bit about my father talking about the big art show, getting the boxes for the big art show. And there's so many of those that emerged. And going back to Final Gifts, which is a wonderful book and was a great find for me when I first began the research. They talk about people, the big golf tournament. I love that. When I first read it in their book, I thought, golf? And then I started hearing these golf stories from people, and I was like, wow, that's amazing. People talking about golf, the big golf tournament, or the bridge game, and a lot of dancing. People talking about getting ready for the dance, or preparing for this big party. In one case, a minister shared with me about one of his congregants that he was there, and the person was kind of like just scribbling, but not really writing legibly. And he said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm making my invitation list for the big party." And so that comes up too pretty frequently. So yeah, the momentous event oftentimes is so connected to the person's life, right? The things they care about. And, you know, for like Jeffrey Holder, who was a choreographer, a dancer and choreographer, his very final words were arms 2, 3, 4, turn 2, 3, 4.
Oh,
Down.
he's dancing.
He was dancing.
Oh, just before he died?
Just before he died, those were the exact, it came from his son, and it also was in the New York Times, so it's documented there, but those were literally the very final words that he said. So, yeah, and I think it varies. I mean, everyone is different, just like we live differently. People obviously die very differently, but these momentous metaphors are pretty common and show up a lot.
And I really appreciate the fact that, and I'd never heard it sort of qualified as a signature metaphor before, which I think is really beautiful.
Good.
Because I've been in hospice at the bedside with people, and we know about the travel because that comes up a lot, or some of the other ones that you're talking about. But sometimes there'll be this nonsensical kind of conversation, and the staff would say, well, they're making no sense. And I would say, have you asked the family? Have you talked to the loved ones or the family? It may be nonsensical to you, but if you turn to the family or the loved ones and ask them, does this mean anything to you? Often they would go, oh, yes, well, they loved this, or this was a significant part of their life, and then all of a sudden, in the context of what the family knows more intimately about that person in the signature arena, it takes on a whole different meaning that could have been missed had they not engaged the loved ones who knew the intricacy of that person's heart and life and being more. So I love the fact that you highlight that, because that can be, and I've seen beautiful situations where so much could have been missed had the staff not leaned in more like that. So
I'm so glad. Oh, I'm so glad, because it is. I'm really glad that might be a contribution or an offering from my work, and it really is true that we are who we are, and we live who we are, and we seem to die who we are. I remember one person I interviewed, her father was a contractor, and right before he was dying, she said, "Are you okay, Daddy? What's going on?" He said, "It's beautiful. There are so many kitchenettes." And like, for me, my idea of heaven is not
it's not kitchenettes.
Not a bunch of remodeling to do, and that's why, or for that matter, a poker game, which one grandfather mentioned to his daughter that there was a foursome. This was also common, that there was a threesome playing golf or playing poker or bridge, and they needed a fourth.
Right.
They're gonna complete that. But yeah, well, I'm glad. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, the other thing I want to ask you about, we hear a lot about light and visual experiences. We're just now I actually had a conversation with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross about this back in the 90s. About the sound and auditory experiences, because she had talked about how open children are. She was a live event that one of the hospices had back in the early 90s I attended. And I said, don't the children ever tell you about the sound? And she looked at me and she smiled and she said, oh, yes, my dear, they love to bathe in the music. Oh. So and then we got into an amazing conversation. It's a pivotal moment and a touching moment in my life journey in this work. But so you talk a little bit about auditory experiences and how music seems to come up, but how that comes up in the language, because I think it's important to lean into too, not just the visual ones, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we know that, as I talked before about this sort of continuum of language, and it does seem, from the research, in the past we've talked left and right brain, and it's not quite that simple. It's more complicated, but there are regions of the brain that seem to be associated with music, and traditionally what we call the right brain, right? I mean, again, these are very loose terms because it's a little more complicated, but I'm going to use those terms just as handles for now. And when you think about the right brain, or that way of being and thinking in the world, it tends to be more musical. It's not verbal, right? I mean, it's more the ineffable part of the human experience, or the more mystical. And I think somehow that part of us becomes more awakened. I mean, it could be just maybe the more left brain just kind of shuts down, or who knows, or it's consciousness. I don't know what the answer is. I have some ideas or guesses, but what we do know is, that musical aspect of us seems to awaken. And what is that great, I think it's Bach who said, "Don't cry for me, for I go where the music is born." Right? And
just before he died.
And we also know, we know near-death experiencers come back who weren't musical, and they come back with musical gifts, right? And they hear music. And and the language of end of life is very repetitive. There's a lot more repetition in the language of end of life, or in the transcripts I received. There was much more repetition than you see in ordinary language, or day to day. And repetition has a musical quality to it, and it's more about kind of a percussive quality versus, it carries more percussive power than meaning. I mean, percussive has its own meaning, right? So when Steve Jobs, his very final words were, "Oh, wow, oh, wow, wow," that had a percussive quality, in terms of, and obviously it was an exclamation. But, we also know with Alzheimer's patients that many times music can activate, lyrics. My mother right now, is dying right now. And she can still sing lyrics to songs from her 1950s. It's amazing. So it does seem like, where music is stored and where music lives, at least the spiritual part of me feels like it's more closely aligned to the other, to the other world, which I've come to believe there is some other dimension now. I've come to really feel that. I don't know what it is. I don't know how it works, but it does feel like, consciousness continues, and it feels like somehow music is very closely associated to that. And, you have threshold choirs, and a lot of people have seen that, end of life music, they're seeing, when I think about my own dying, I want to have beautiful music. It just feels so comforting. And even though we love words, there's something about the rhythm and the notes and everything of music that can touch us and comfort us in ways that words can't. So, and also I heard, and I'm sure all your decades long of experience in the field, that I was told by hospice nurses that watch what you say, because people can really, their auditory is very, very, very keen. And she said, when you're in the other room, make sure your words about your father are kind ones, because that's what he's going to carry with him to the grave, right? That's what he's going to hear. And she was talking about how oftentimes people get in fights right at the bedside of their loved one about, who's going to get the couch, and people are hearing it on some level.
I remember being at the bedside once with a woman who'd been unconscious for days, and the family was around her, and they started to joke about one family member. And in the middle of it, and she hadn't been conscious for days, she woke up and she goes, "That's not how the story goes." And they all looked and went, "Oh," and she corrected all of them, engaged for a bit, and so they all decided from that moment on they had to be really careful. But it was a true example of her being more aware and engaged than they realized, even though she wasn't speaking, right? But you also speak about bells and chimes. Sometimes you hear the loved one's voice calling. So could you speak to that?
Yes.
Because that's an auditory experience too, right?
Well, yeah, I think people, but I think that was, people describe that for themselves, that they hear music as they're leaving, or they hear beautiful, bells, chimes, literally music. And people also say that after their loved one dies, they'll hear music that reminds them of that person. So, there are these stories. Again, this is after-death communication, which I did not expect to do in my research, but it so organically grew from the research, because people might say, as Dad was dying, we played this song, excuse me, and then 3 weeks later, I kept hearing that song over and over again on the radio, which made me feel like Dad was with me. But I think that music and these sounds of chimes and bells, and they are, as part of the lore, Lore, of death and dying, hearing bells and chimes. But I think there are people who actually are having those experiences, and either as they're dying and then for loved ones after their loved one goes. I think people report hearing all kinds of interesting sounds. So the auditory, we're multi-sensory beings. And at the end of life, I really feel, for whatever reason, the auditory, it becomes really important at the end.
Well, and I'm just going to divert a bit to honor your part about neurodiversity. When I was younger, I was a lifeguard and swimming instructor. And I was at one point asked to work with mentally and physically challenged children, and I hadn't worked with them before. And they pointed to me, and there was 2 little boys that were identical twins, and they were curled up in a little ball, rocking, wouldn't look at anybody, kind of like this gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And they said, "Barb, you're going to work with them." And I was like, and so we tried to do both together, eventually did one at a time, but they would get in the water with me, and they were like cats trying to climb up me like I was a telephone pole, didn't want to be in the water. And then one day I just started singing. Mary had a little lamp. And as soon as I started singing, the little guy kind of leaned in to listen. And I went, oh. Yeah. And so we started singing, and it was beautiful. And in the end, ended up doing amazing work in the pool. But the last day I was with this one, Jingle Bells was his favorite. I went over to him and bent down and whispered, and he was like this, rocking, and in the posture, I whispered Jingle Bells, and he literally stood straight up, put his hand out to me, looked me straight in the eye, dropped the whole facade, looked me straight in the eye, and all I felt was love and gratitude from his eyes. He took my hand and guided me over to the side of the pool. I was in awe. I couldn't believe it. And then he fell back into the posture. And I just thought, on a profound level, there was just, through the music, there was this connection. And I've never forgotten about that when I'm at the bedside, because what seemed to be an impossible or challenging situation at first, just through the beauty of the music. And I can't sing, but he would laugh and play, both of them, in the end. And so I remembered that moving into the hospice work, and with my mother with Alzheimer's, we would celebrate everything that she said and lean into it. And she would laugh and giggle and then tell us she loved us, right? So I love the fact we're talking about this, because it's so much richer than people acknowledge. So this is so beautiful. I love this, Lisa. I mean, and it helps the patient and it helps the family, right?
Yeah, because I was thinking while you were talking about that beautiful story with swimming, is lullabies.
Right, and that was the next thing I wanted.
Yeah, oh, you did. Yeah, because I was just when you have a baby and, words, you can't say to your baby, listen, just get to sleep. It's all okay. Come on, get over it. I can forget that. That's never going to work, right? But you sing. And what is it that song carries that words don't, right? Well, you could argue it's that other part of the brain, right? That other part of the brain that seems to expand as we die. In many cases, not always, but that part of our consciousness seems to expand, that place where music is, which is that ineffable place that ideally soothes us and touches us. I mean, we know from near-death experiencers and from in the work in the Final Words Project, many people as they're dying too, suddenly there's kind of an awareness of something, a different part of our experience as beings that's more expanded or comforting. I mean, again, much more in terms of working in hospice because of all your years of work, but my limited knowledge, what I've seen is that it seems like, dying is not, being born is not easy, and dying doesn't seem to be easy.
Well, labor in both, right? The labor of birth and the labor of death, right?
But there is, or what I've learned is there's oftentimes a period of like this surrendering. There's something that happens, not always, but often. And in that surrender, there's this connection. It's like that place where the music is. That's all I can say. I don't know enough, right? But just that place where the music is. It's the same place when you are, singing to your child, right? There's something we're connecting with, that comfort that we all recognize and brings all of us comfort. Mm-hmm. And as much as I love words, and I do, gosh, I love them, there's something about that place where the words aren't, that the music is.
Well, and even you talk about silence. You have a chapter titled Lullabies and Goodbyes, and you talk about the silent. There are no words when a newborn arrives, and often when someone at end of life is cocooning in. So can you speak to the texture of silence as well, and communication that you've observed throughout words, or people trying to share that?
Yeah, I love, when you were speaking about your connection with your mom, one thing that when we can, it's really, I'm taking piano lessons. I figured after 60 years, it was time for me to finally pursue my interest in music. And, we know with music that if it just, it's like, blah, 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 but if you take pauses and you rest and you use silence and you see it all as kind of a tapestry of impressions, right? And you craft it with love. There's a kind of impact it has versus just like bang, 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 right? So the language of the threshold to me is so much about, it's as much music as it is meaning and sense. So what that means to me is that silence is a part of music, right? I mean, if you look at any score of music, there are these pauses, right? And there are these rests and so forth. And the story I love the most, because it so impacted me, was someone I interviewed. She had talked about, she and her mother used to gab, they had this great connection talking. I mean, my mother were the same way. And when her mother became ill, it was really, really hard for her to let go of those conversations, right? I mean, that's what connects us so often to the people we love. And she was just sort of getting into meditation at the time and prayer. So something inspired her one day, because her mother was so quiet and she was feeling such a sense of loss. And so she just decided to go and just kind of, I'm going to just pray and meditate and just be in presence with her and just imagine I'm talking to her telepathically, right? Mm. Just, I'm just there. So she sat there just really in peace and quiet, just hearing her mother's breathing, and then just felt, and then all of a sudden there's like a quiet knock on the door from one of the nurses and said, Mrs. Jones, whatever, Mrs. Everything okay in there? And the mother wakes up and says, I've been having the most amazing conversation with my daughter. And this person I interviewed she was so blown away, and it really changed her perspective. But, if you look at the way mothers and fathers relate to their children, oftentimes there are these connections that I don't know if telepathic is quite the right word, but, many of the times that we connect with people, or even lovers, right? There are moments where silence speaks volumes, right? Speaks, and we have to have trust in those kind of, nonverbal bonds. And we know from the near-death experience, like Eben Alexander in his book, Proof of Heaven, was talking about his experience, his NDE, and he was saying that there's like this telepathic communication that he experienced in the quote afterlife, or what he called the afterlife, or during his experience. And he called it non-linguistic communication, is what he called called it. And I have no idea what that is. I don't, but well, maybe it's close to what I'm talking about, but it's a kind of communication that's not done with words. And I think in the beginning of life and at the end of life, that is an opportunity, it's an opportunity for us to explore what that might be for us and not be afraid of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have a quote from one of your participants. His name was Tim, and he said, "There was no speaking, as the person's lips never moved, and neither did mine, but there were words. It was a question, are you ready?"
Yeah.
That was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so now we have family by the bedside or staff working with someone dying, and all of a sudden the language starts changing.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to them in response to that, instead of going, "Oh, that doesn't make sense"? What would you encourage them to do to engage in this changing awareness?
First, have faith that something. I can't help but use the word sacred, and I hope, but just
beautiful.
Have faith in the process, and it's hard to do, but just assume if sacred is a word that people can't relate to, if they can, just imagine it's a sacred process. If that's a word that they're not too sure what that means to them, just know that it's a human process, that what's going on at the end of life, the way language changes, it's human for there to be shifts that can deepen connections. So that see those shifts as an invitation to deepen connections between the people you love, and if you believe in a divine source, also source, if that's something that is meaningful to you. And it's sort of like, when children, that their language isn't fully formed, when they're really young, we can still have beautiful, beautiful connections with kids when they're talking about the invisible rabbit in the room. And, there might be an invisible rabbit in the room. Like, who are we to know, really? but just the kinds of connections we can form with our kids when language might be shifting or may not be fully formed. And I'm, again, by no means saying that when someone's dying, they're a kid by any means. But to not be afraid of the language and see it as an opportunity. And I kind of like, what I was telling myself at the time is imagine that I'm kind of in a different country and have that same sense of wonder and curiosity and have faith that your loved one is communicating in new ways, in different ways, and maybe even bringing something of the divine and sacred, or at least of this different reality to you as a gift. I mean, to kind of use it and imagine what might be the pearls of their communication. And sometimes when people are dying, they actually have words of sort of prophetic wisdom. I mean, if you listen and write down. So one of the things that I recommend people do, and many families have told me it's been helpful, is just near the bedside, just have a journal where you write down things. And when different people come in the room, they just write down, and then you can kind of start tracking what people are saying. And one thing that I've seen more than I never imagined is people sometimes when they're dying will start some kind of story. Mm-hmm. I call these sustained narratives. Mm. So like one case in this one family, even they kept a journal. And, like I said, bedside, where they're writing down what the loved one says. Some people prefer a recorder, but there's something nice about this if it's non-obtrusive and everyone's okay with it. But the father started talking about this train, and the train wasn't working. And this was about 3 weeks before he died. But then every day there was something going on with that train. Now, if you get it out of context, you wouldn't realize that over this period, he was telling a story. Now, how can you say, this is a brain that's supposed to be like completely non-functional, right? Someone's going to death, but how does this person try? They're telling a story. How do they remember what they said the day before? I just don't. It's just in awe. But like I said, I call this a sustained narrative. So by keeping notes, sometimes by the bed, you can say, look back and say, oh my God, 2 days ago, Daddy was talking about the train pulling into the station, and now he's saying that, do I have my suitcase or whatever? But you can track these sustained narratives, and they don't always happen with everyone, but they do happen. And so, sometimes having a journal works, just having the spirit of curiosity and assuming that something sacred is happening, assuming, knowing that it's natural, knowing that there are many pearls often, and to just walk in with that assumption, because it is scary hearing language change from someone we love. It is scary. And I've heard from so many people when they walk into the room with kind of a sense of what the metaphors might be and what, and also doing what you talked about, being playful, not disrespectful in any way, but kind of joyful and playful and connecting. What can happen when you do that? Because then more language, and you start hearing about things people are experiencing that are really, when my dad, I don't think I mentioned this earlier in the interview, when my dad looked at me and said, "The angels are in the room with me now." And I'm like, "Wow, Daddy," And he said, "Yeah, they say 3 days left, only 3 days left." I'm like, "Wow." Now, I was like, okay. And 3 days later, he dies.
Right. Prophetic.
Now, before I did this research, I would have just thought, "Oh, Daddy's got, he's taking too much morphine and who knows." But it's like, wow, there's there's such a wealth of, material, for lack of a better word, but a wealth of offerings. And I think from people I've spoken to and I've seen for myself, it's so much richer to embrace them rather than be afraid. It's richer for everyone. Everyone benefits. Everyone from that.
Curious, be playful, ask open-ended questions to engage. That's beautiful, Lisa. Thank you. So I just have two last little questions. One is about poetry. Why do you think, you've touched on it, love and poetry go hand in hand? I want to hear this from the linguist.
That's a great question. Why the love and poetry? Just because I think poets try to express the inexpressible with words. We try to make music of language. And we want to, and I like to think there's a sense of wonder, in being a poet. And I think there's a sense of wonder in love. When we live our lives with love, and like even with the dying process, which is, I'm going through with my mom. It's been so hard. And yet I'm so grateful. I've had 10 years of developing a sense of wonder about the process versus sheer fear. And it isn't always easy. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. Believe me, this has been 15 months with my mother. That's been just really, really challenging at times. But I'm so grateful. So love and poetry is that sense of wonder. I have to say this because my mother is dying and I really want to just say these words. She would sign every one of her emails. Her signature was "Stay amazed."
Oh.
And so I just have
to say, beautiful.
That's beautiful, and that's who she is. And I really feel like if in the context of language at end of life, if with poetry to me is about staying amazed, right? Staying amazed. And it's not always easy. I mean, some of the things I've seen with my mom this year, it's been hard to stay amazed sometimes. But that's a great question. Yeah, love and poetry definitely go together for me.
Well, and a beautiful reflection to leave us with around this, to stay amazed. That's open and curious and engaging in life as is, right? Even when it's difficult, there can be stunning moments, right? So
absolutely. My father wrote one line from a poem that I love, and I have it in my living room. I took a lot of his final words and you can see some of them behind, but made like plaques of them. And one of them was, he said, "Either end of the scale is music." So either end, the low notes or the high notes, it's all music. And so it's hard to live that way. We're all trying, but that's part of the stay amazed principle, right?
It's beautiful. Wow. Lovely. So my final signature question, I ask everybody this. How has your heart, or has it, been changed by this work?
Oh my God, how has it not? Well, first, I do believe that consciousness continues now in some way. I'm not sure how, but it's deep in my belief in something bigger than me. And I think I just have a very different relationship to death and dying, which makes me have a very different relationship to life. And it's deepened my love for music. It's funny, we've talked so much about that today, but my appreciation for the nonverbal. I spent most of my life studying language, and now it's become really clear to me. I'm less afraid. I'm definitely less afraid of dying. I mean, I used to ride on an airplane and I would white knuckle. I don't. I mean, I'm not, I mean, obviously, if I, I want to live as long as I can and be healthy. It's not like but, and just the mystery. I mean, I think the more I learn, the deeper the mystery gets, and sort of a humility. I think death keeps us humble. Because one last thing is that, I did this book and I felt like I made some connections, just a little bit. And then my mother, and I thought I knew some things. And then my mother's 15 months of dying have just been very confusing and challenging. And I realized how little I knew, which is great, because it's always good to know how little we know. And so, I think there's kind of a humility in doing this work. So it's both. On one hand, I feel more like open to something sacred, and I feel more alive and more in awe. And I also feel more humble in a way, because
Well, and death does that. It's a leveler, right? So it brings heartache and love and joy all kind of wrapped in one. So I appreciate you sharing that, because we're talking about some of the magical things that are said, but often they emerge from the midst of suffering or challenge, but they can give insight and help us connect in a deeper way if we're open to it, even amidst the challenge, right? So,
Amen.
and being the eternal learner and being open to learn. That's lovely to leave us with that too. So before I go, I do want to again return people to your book. It's a beautiful book, Lisa. And I think by the end of it too, you are reminded of a sense of awe and curiosity. So it's another reason I really appreciate what you're doing. So to find out more about your research and the book Words on the Threshold, What We Say as We're Nearing Death, you can go to and Raymond Moody's involved in the website too, the website finalwordsproject.org. And I really encourage people to take a look at that. And thank you so much. I mean, there's so many flavors of this, and it's really an emerging science in many ways, and you're at the forefront of highlighting it. So I really appreciate this conversation and all that you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for your work too, really.
Okay.
Be well.